The most dangerous woman in the room is never the loudest one. It's the one who learned how to be invisible. The candlelight flickered softly across the marble dining table, casting golden reflections against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Manhattan penthouse, and Naomi Carter sat perfectly still in a silk black dress that shimmered like quiet armor under the chandelier, her fingers resting lightly on the stem of a crystal glass that had long since gone untouched, the city below alive with movement, horns, laughter, life continuing as if this night meant nothing, as if 5 years of marriage could simply dissolve into silence, and across from her, an empty chair waited, its presence louder than any voice, its absence heavier than any betrayal, because this wasn't the first time William Harrington had not come home, it wasn't even the 10th. But tonight was different. Tonight marked 5 years since the day she had stood beside him in a cathedral filled with white roses and promises spoken in steady voices. Promises that had sounded like forever, promises that now felt like something borrowed from a story that was never meant for her, her reflection faintly visible in the glass behind the table, poised, elegant, composed, a woman anyone would call beautiful, yet somehow invisible to the one man who was supposed to see her the most, and as the clock on the far wall ticked past 9, then 10, then 11, the silence grew thicker, wrapping around her like a second skin, until finally her phone lit up, a single message appearing with the cold efficiency that had defined their entire marriage. Don't wait up, no explanation, no apology, just 4 words that carried the weight of everything he had never said. Naomi's gaze didn't waver, not even for a second, as she read it, because she had learned long ago that reactions were wasted in a world where she was not truly seen. Instead she lifted the glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down with deliberate precision, the faint sound echoing in the vast space like a quiet decision being made, and somewhere deep beneath the calm surface, something shifted, not broken, not shattered, but refined, like steel. Forged under years of pressure, her mind drifting back through the moments that had built this silence, the endless dinners eaten alone, the galas where she stood at his side while his attention drifted elsewhere, the introductions where her name was spoken as an afterthought, if at all, the way his world had expanded while hers had been carefully reduced to fit within the margins of his life, and still, she had remained, not out of weakness, but because she had believed in something greater than appearances, believed that patience had value, that loyalty meant something. But tonight, sitting across from an empty chair that had become far too familiar, she finally understood the truth she had been avoiding. She had not been abandoned, she had been erased, and the realization did not bring tears, it brought clarity, the kind that settles in quietly, without announcement, reshaping everything it touches. Naomi reached for the small velvet box resting beside her plate, opening it with steady hands to reveal the diamond ring that had once symbolized a beginning, its brilliance catching the light in a way that felt almost ironic now. She studied it for a moment, not with bitterness, but with a calm detachment that surprised even her. Then slowly, carefully, she slipped it off her finger, placing it on the table where the empty chair could see it, as if leaving behind a message for a man who had long stopped reading between the lines. And in that moment, the silence was no longer something that trapped her, it was something she controlled, the city lights outside flickering like distant stars as she stood, smoothing the fabric of her dress with quiet grace. Her reflection in the glass no longer looked invisible, it looked resolved, and without a word, without a single glance back, Naomi Carter walked away from the table, from the empty chair, from the life that had never truly made space for her, and somewhere in the quiet echo of her heels against marble, the first step of something far greater than revenge began to take shape. The city did not notice when Naomi Carter left that night, and perhaps that was the final proof of everything she had come to understand. Because invisibility does not begin in a single moment, it is built slowly, quietly, through 1,000 overlooked details, and as the elevator doors closed behind her, the soft reflection of her face in the mirrored walls revealed a woman who no longer expected to be seen, only to see clearly. The ride down from the penthouse felt longer than usual, each floor a quiet countdown not just to the street below, but to a version of herself she was finally ready to release. And when the doors opened into the lobby, the familiar warmth of polished marble and soft lighting greeted her like a memory that no longer belonged to her. The doorman offered a polite nod, the same one he had given her for years, respectful, distant, unaware that tonight was not like the others, unaware that this was not another evening where she would step out and return. But the moment she chose not to come back at all, outside, the cool Manhattan air wrapped around her shoulders, crisp and alive, carrying the distant hum of traffic and possibility, and for the first time in a long time, Naomi did not reach for her phone, did not check for another message that would never come with warmth. Instead she simply stood there, breathing in the night as if it were something new, something earned, her mind drifting through the quiet truths she had ignored for too long, the contracts she had signed without reading carefully enough, the shares she had once held before they were restructured under Williams' guidance, the meetings she had not been invited to, the decisions made without her presence, all of it forming a pattern that now seemed impossible to unsee, because neglect was never just emotional, it was strategic, and she had mistaken silence for peace, when in reality it had been a slow erasure of her place in a world she helped build. A black car passed by, its headlights briefly illuminating her figure on the sidewalk. And in that fleeting light, something shifted again, not dramatic, not loud, but precise, like a decision settling into place. Naomi turned and began to walk, her heels steady against the pavement, each step carrying her further away from a life defined by absence and closer to something she would define herself. She did not know exactly what it would look like yet, but she knew what it would not be. It would not be quiet in the wrong way, it would not be conditional, it would not require her to shrink to be accepted, and as she reached the corner, she paused, glancing up at the towering glass building that had once felt like a symbol of success, now nothing more than a reflection of everything she had outgrown. Her gaze did not linger, because she was not looking back anymore, she was calculating, remembering the skills she had set aside, the education she had earned before marriage, the connections she had quietly maintained, the part of herself that had never truly disappeared, only waited, and for the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge a truth that felt both simple and powerful. She had never been powerless, she had only been patient, and patience, when sharpened by clarity, becomes something far more dangerous than anger, it becomes strategy. Naomi stepped off the curb as the light changed, moving forward with a calm that was almost unsettling in its certainty, because somewhere between the silence of that empty chair and the quiet of this street, she had made a decision that would not announce itself tonight, would not demand attention, but would grow, piece by piece, until the world that once ignored her would have no choice but to see her, and when that moment came, it would not be loud, it would not be cruel, it would simply be undeniable. Morning arrived without ceremony, a pale gray light filtering through the tall windows of a small furnished apartment Naomi Carter had secured before the city fully woke, the space modest compared to the penthouse she had left behind. But there was something in its simplicity that felt honest, untouched by expectation or performance, a clean slate in every sense. She stood by the window with a cup of black coffee warming her hands, watching as early commuters moved with purpose below, each person carrying a life that demanded to be lived, not observed from the sidelines, and for the first time in years, she felt aligned with that movement rather than removed from it. Her reflection in the glass was different now, not because her appearance had changed, but because her gaze had. There was focus where there had once been quiet endurance, calculation where there had once been hope, and as she set the cup down on the narrow kitchen counter, she reached for a slim leather folder she had carried with her the night before, placing it carefully on the table as if it contained something far more valuable than paper. Inside were documents she had not looked at in years. Not because they were unimportant, but because she had trusted someone else to manage them, a trust that now felt misplaced in ways she could no longer ignore. Her fingers moved deliberately as she opened the folder, scanning lines of contracts, equity agreements, and signatures that once seemed routine, now revealing patterns she had overlooked, percentages that had shifted over time, clauses that had quietly redefined ownership, structures that had slowly removed her from positions she once held, all executed with the kind of precision that did not require confrontation, only time and inattention. And Naomi did not react with anger, she reacted with clarity, because anger would have been loud, immediate, and ultimately ineffective, while clarity allowed her to see the full architecture of what had been done, and more importantly, what could be undone. She reached for her phone, scrolling through contacts she had not called in years, names that represented more than social connections. They represented access, knowledge, leverage, and after a brief pause, she selected one and pressed call. The line rang twice before a voice answered, warm but cautious. Surprised to hear from her after so long, Naomi did not explain everything. She did not need to. Her words were measured, direct, outlining only what was necessary, a request for information, for discretion, for a meeting that would remain off record, and as the conversation ended, she felt the first piece of something larger fall into place, not dramatic, not visible to anyone else, but significant in a way that would compound over time. She moved through the apartment with quiet efficiency, setting aside anything that belonged to the life she had left, replacing it with structure, intention, purpose. The hours passed without distraction, each moment invested in understanding the landscape she was about to step into again, not as a wife, not as a shadow, but as a strategist, and somewhere between reviewing financial statements and mapping out the connections she would need to rebuild, Naomi allowed herself a single, brief acknowledgement of what this all meant, not revenge, not even justice in the way most people would define it, but restoration, a return to something that had always been hers, simply waiting for her to claim it. The city outside continued to move, unaware that within this quiet apartment, a shift had already begun, subtle, precise, and entirely unstoppable. And as the afternoon light stretched across the floor, Naomi Carter closed the final document, her expression calm, her mind clear, because she was no longer reacting to what had been done to her, she was preparing for what she would do next. The meeting was set for exactly 9:30 in the morning, not because Naomi Carter needed the precision, but because precision signaled intent, and intent was something she was reclaiming piece by piece. The conference room she stepped into was understated, glass walls, a long walnut table, the kind of space designed for decisions that shaped outcomes quietly, without spectacle, and across from her sat Daniel Brooks, a senior partner at a firm that did not advertise its influence but was known by those who needed to know, his expression measured, observant, the kind of man who understood value without asking unnecessary questions. And for a brief moment, the past and present seemed to overlap, because years ago, before her marriage had redefined her role, Naomi had been the one sitting at tables like this regularly, speaking in numbers, negotiating in silence, building something that had later been absorbed into a life where her voice became optional. But that version of her had not disappeared, it had simply been waiting, and as she took her seat, placing her folder neatly in front of her, there was no hesitation in the way she met his gaze, no trace of the woman who had once accepted being overlooked. Daniel spoke first, a simple acknowledgement of time past, of circumstances that had changed, and Naomi responded with equal restraint, not offering explanations, only direction. She outlined what she needed, a full reconstruction of her original equity positions, a forensic review of corporate restructuring over the past 5 years, and most importantly, a path forward that did not rely on permission from anyone who had once controlled access. Her voice remained calm, steady, each word chosen with care, because she was not here to prove anything, she was here to execute. And as the conversation unfolded, Daniel's initial curiosity shifted into something closer to respect, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. There was no emotion in her delivery, only clarity, and clarity, in rooms like this, was currency. Documents were exchanged, timelines discussed, possibilities outlined in terms that did not promise outcomes but revealed opportunities, and Naomi listened more than she spoke, absorbing details, identifying leverage points, understanding not just what had been taken, but how it had been taken, because that distinction mattered. It was not enough to want something back, she needed to understand the system that had allowed it to be removed in the first place. And as Daniel paused, asking the one question that mattered most, whether she was prepared for the complexity of what she was initiating, Naomi did not answer immediately. She allowed a brief silence to settle, not out of uncertainty, but because some answers carried more weight when they were not rushed. Then she simply said yes, not loudly, not with emphasis, just a single word delivered with the kind of certainty that did not require reinforcement. The meeting concluded without ceremony, no handshake lingered longer than necessary, no promises were made beyond what could be controlled. But as Naomi stood and gathered her folder, there was a shift in the air, subtle but undeniable, because something had officially begun, not visible to the world outside, not even to William Harrington, who at that very moment was likely moving through his day with the same confidence he had carried for years, unaware that the structure supporting that confidence was about to be examined, piece by piece. Naomi stepped out into the hallway, the quiet hum of the building surrounding her. And for the first time since she had walked away from that empty chair, the path ahead was no longer abstract. It had shape, it had direction, and most importantly, it had momentum. And as she exited onto the street, the sunlight catching briefly on the glass doors behind her, she did not look back, because this was no longer about where she had been, it was about where she was going, and where she was going would not be built on silence, it would be built on decisions like this, deliberate, precise, and impossible to ignore once they began to take effect. The days that followed did not announce themselves as transformation, they unfolded quietly, measured in early mornings and late nights, in the soft glow of a laptop screen and the steady rhythm of decisions being made without hesitation. Naomi Carter moved through them with a discipline that felt both familiar and entirely new. Her small apartment becoming less of a temporary refuge and more of a command center where every detail mattered, every call had purpose, every document revealed another layer of the structure she was preparing to rebuild. She no longer filled her time with waiting, she filled it with action, reviewing financial records that Daniel Brooks and his team had begun to assemble, tracing the flow of assets with a precision that left no room for assumption, each page confirming what she had already sensed, that what had been taken from her was not lost, it had simply been repositioned, hidden behind complexity, shielded by confidence that she would never look closely enough to see it, but she was looking now, and what she saw did not discourage her, it sharpened her focus. She began reconnecting with people who remembered her before she became an afterthought, former colleagues, advisors, investors who had once respected her instincts and now listened again with renewed attention, not because of who she had been married to, but because of the clarity in her voice, the certainty in her strategy. Meetings were set in places that did not draw attention, quiet offices, private dining rooms, conversations that unfolded without spectacle but carried weight in every word. Naomi did not speak about the past, she did not explain her absence, she simply presented the future as she saw it, and that was enough, because credibility, once established, does not disappear, it waits to be recognized again. And as the network around her began to reassemble, piece by piece, she felt the momentum building, not as something external, but as something internal, a return to alignment between who she was and what she was capable of. The evenings no longer ended in silence, they ended in progress, notes organized, next steps outlined, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that every move she made was deliberate. And somewhere across the city, in a world of glass towers and boardroom conversations, William Harrington continued as he always had, unaware that the patterns he relied on were being studied, that the systems he trusted were being mapped, that the absence he had grown comfortable with was no longer empty, it was occupied by intention. Naomi did not think of him often, not in the way she once had. There was no lingering question of why, no need for answers that would not change anything. Instead, she considered him only in terms of structure, of position, of the role he played in a system she was preparing to engage with on entirely different terms. And as the week drew to a close, she stood once again by the window of her apartment, the city stretching out before her, no longer distant, no longer something she observed from behind glass, but something she was stepping back into with purpose, her reflection steady, composed, unmistakably present. And for a brief moment, she allowed herself to recognize the distance she had already traveled, not measured in miles, but in clarity, in control, in the quiet power of no longer needing to be acknowledged in order to exist, because now, existence was not the goal, impact was, and impact, she knew, did not ask for permission, it arrived, unmistakable and irreversible. And as she turned away from the window, reaching for the next set of documents waiting on her table, there was no doubt left in her mind. She was not rebuilding what she had lost, she was constructing something far more precise, something that would not depend on anyone else to define its value, something that, when revealed, would not need explanation, only recognition. By the second week, the pattern was no longer forming, it was accelerating. Naomi Carter's days had become a sequence of deliberate moves that no longer required hesitation, each morning beginning before the city fully awakened, each decision layered carefully on top of the last. And while nothing about her work was visible on the surface, beneath it, a structure was taking shape with quiet precision. Daniel Brooks had delivered the first comprehensive report, a detailed breakdown of asset transitions, shell reallocations, and strategic dilutions that had occurred over the past 5 years. And as Naomi reviewed the pages, her expression did not change, but her understanding deepened. The design was elegant in its complexity, a gradual shift that ensured no single move would appear significant on its own. But together, they had effectively removed her from positions she once held without ever requiring confrontation. It was not reckless, it was calculated, and that realization did not anger her, it clarified the level at which she now needed to operate. She traced the flow of ownership with her finger, identifying leverage points where the structure could be engaged, not through disruption, but through acquisition, through alignment, through the same quiet mechanisms that had once been used against her, except now, they would be used with intention she controlled. Her phone buzzed softly against the table, a message from one of the investors she had reconnected with earlier in the week, confirmation of interest, a willingness to explore an opportunity that had not yet been fully revealed. Naomi responded with a time and a location, nothing more, because explanation would come later, when the framework was ready to support it. The meetings that followed were not dramatic, they were precise, held in spaces where discretion was understood, conversations focused on numbers, projections, possibilities that extended beyond what was currently visible, and each time she spoke, it was with the same calm authority, not asking for belief, but presenting a vision that made belief unnecessary, because it was grounded in structure, in data, in a clarity that did not rely on emotion, and slowly, the pieces began to align. Capital positioning, advisory support, access to channels that had once been closed to her. All reassembling in a way that felt less like building something new and more like reclaiming something that had always belonged to her reach. Across the city, William Harrington continued his routine, board meetings, interviews, public appearances that reinforced the image he had spent years cultivating, an image of control, of certainty, of a man who understood every aspect of the world he operated in. But control, Naomi now understood, was often built on assumptions, and assumptions, once examined, revealed their limits. She did not rush, she did not announce, because timing was as important as strategy, and premature movement would only weaken what she was preparing to execute. Instead, she allowed the process to unfold at the pace it required, reviewing, adjusting, ensuring that every step forward strengthened the position she was creating, and as the days continued, the distance between who she had been and who she was becoming grew more defined, not in appearance, but in presence, in the way she moved through spaces, in the way conversations shifted when she entered them, no longer overlooked, no longer secondary, but central, deliberate, undeniable. And one evening, as she stood once again by her window, the city lights stretching endlessly before her, she realized something that settled into her with quiet certainty. She was no longer preparing to return to his world, she was preparing to reshape it. And when that moment arrived, it would not feel like intrusion, it would feel like inevitability, because everything she was doing now was leading to a point where recognition would not be requested, it would be required. And as she turned back toward her table, where the final draft of a proposal waited, outlined with precision and intent, Naomi Carter allowed herself a single, steady breath, because the next phase was no longer about understanding, it was about execution, and execution, once begun, would not be undone. The invitation arrived without fanfare, a simple black envelope with embossed silver lettering that carried more weight than any announcement could. Naomi Carter turned it over once in her hands before opening it, already knowing what it would contain: the annual Harrington Global Gala, a night where power dressed itself in elegance and influence moved behind polite conversations. A room where William Harrington would stand at the center, confident, untouchable, exactly where he believed he belonged. And as Naomi read the details, the date, the location, the guest list curated with precision, she felt something settle into place. Not anticipation, not anxiety, but alignment, because this was not coincidence, this was timing, the kind of timing that only mattered when preparation had already been completed. She set the invitation down on the table beside her proposal, her gaze steady as she considered the layers of what was about to unfold. For weeks she had been building quietly, assembling capital, securing partnerships, positioning herself in ways that remained invisible to those who were not looking closely. And now, for the first time, there would be a moment where visibility was not only possible, it was necessary. She reached for her phone, sending a brief message to Daniel Brooks, a confirmation that the next phase would begin sooner than originally planned. His response came quickly, concise, acknowledging what he already understood, that once this step was taken, there would be no returning to the shadows. Naomi did not hesitate. Hesitation belonged to the version of her that had once waited to be acknowledged, and that version no longer existed. The days leading up to the event moved with increased precision, final documents reviewed, agreements solidified, every detail examined to ensure that when the moment arrived, there would be no uncertainty, only execution. She selected her attire with the same deliberate care, a gown that did not demand attention but commanded it, black silk that reflected light in subtle, controlled ways, a silhouette that spoke of restraint and power rather than excess, because this was not about being seen for the sake of it, it was about being recognized for what she had become. The evening of the gala arrived with the quiet intensity of something inevitable, the city alive with anticipation as cars lined the entrance of the grand venue, flashes of cameras capturing faces that had long defined influence. And when Naomi stepped out onto the polished pavement, there was no announcement, no introduction, only presence, her heels steady, her posture composed, the air around her shifting in ways that were not immediately understood but unmistakably felt. Inside, the ballroom shimmered with crystal light and low conversation, the kind of space where alliances were formed with a glance and dismantled with a single word. Naomi moved through it without hesitation, her gaze observant, taking in the familiar architecture of power she had once stood within as an outsider to her own life. And across the room, William Harrington stood exactly where she expected, surrounded, admired, speaking with the ease of a man who believed the world moved according to his design. For a brief moment, their timelines overlapped, not in memory, but in reality. Two paths that had once run parallel now intersecting again under entirely different circumstances. Naomi did not approach him immediately. She did not need to, because this was not about confrontation, it was about positioning. She allowed the room to adjust to her presence, to register the shift without fully understanding it, conversations faltering slightly as recognition began to form, not of who she had been, but of what she now represented. And as she reached the center of the room, accepting a glass she did not intend to drink, her reflection caught in the mirrored column beside her. Calm, precise, undeniable, Naomi Carter understood that the moment she had been preparing for was no longer approaching. It had arrived, and everything that followed would not be a surprise, it would be a result. The shift began as a whisper, subtle enough to be mistaken for coincidence, yet precise enough to alter the rhythm of the entire room. Naomi Carter did not need to announce herself because recognition, when earned, travels faster than sound. One conversation paused, then another, eyes lingering a second longer than before. Names quietly exchanged with a tone that suggested something new had entered a space that rarely welcomed the unexpected, and across the ballroom, William Harrington felt it. Before he understood it, the slight disruption in the seamless flow he had grown accustomed to, the way attention that once centered on him began to fracture, not dramatically, but undeniably. His gaze moved through the crowd with practiced ease until it found the source, and for the first time in years, his composure shifted, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else would immediately notice, but internally, a recalibration that he had not needed in a long time, because standing beneath the chandelier light, composed, self-contained, was Naomi, not as he remembered her, not as the quiet presence who once stood beside him, but as something entirely different, something defined, deliberate, and unmistakably independent of him. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that brief exchange, there was no history, no shared past acknowledged, only recognition of the present. And it was enough to unsettle the foundation of assumptions he had carried for years. Naomi did not move toward him. She did not need to close the distance, because the distance itself had become part of the message. Instead, she turned slightly as a man approached her, one of the investors William recognized immediately, a figure known for aligning only with opportunities that promised significant returns. Their conversation appeared effortless, measured, and as William watched, he realized something that did not fit within his expectations. She was not here as a guest, she was here as a participant in a game he believed he controlled. The evening progressed with the same polished cadence it always had, speeches, introductions, the subtle exchange of influence beneath the surface, but beneath that familiar structure, something had changed. Naomi moved through the space with quiet authority, each interaction reinforcing what the room was beginning to understand, that her presence was not incidental, it was intentional. And as the time came for William to address the audience, stepping onto the stage with the confidence of a man who had never needed to question his position, his voice carried across the room with practiced clarity, outlining growth, vision, the future of Harrington Global. Yet even as he spoke, his awareness remained divided, because somewhere within the crowd stood a variable he had not accounted for, and when the presentation concluded, followed by the expected applause, the next moment unfolded with a precision that could not be mistaken. Daniel Brooks appeared at the edge of the stage, his presence quiet but purposeful, and within seconds, a document was placed into William's hand. Not publicly announced, not displayed, but delivered in a way that carried weight far beyond its physical form. William's expression remained controlled as he glanced down, but the shift was there, subtle, contained, unmistakable to anyone who understood what they were seeing, a proposal, structured with legal precision, outlining a position that had already been partially secured, a pathway toward acquisition that did not ask for agreement, only acknowledgement. And as his gaze lifted from the page, searching instinctively through the room, it found Naomi once more. Standing exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. And in that instant, the balance that had defined their past no longer existed, because this was no longer about what had been ignored, It was about what could no longer be dismissed, and the realization settled not with noise, but with certainty, that the structure he had built was no longer entirely his, and the woman he had once overlooked was now standing at the threshold of everything he believed he controlled. The room did not erupt, it did not fracture into chaos or spectacle, because power rarely collapses loudly, it shifts, quietly, precisely, in moments that only a few recognize for what they truly are. And as William Harrington stood there with the document in his hand, the applause from moments before still echoing faintly in the background, he understood something that had never occurred to him before, that control, the kind he had built his life around, was not permanent, it was conditional, dependent on variables he had never considered could change. His fingers tightened slightly around the paper, not enough to draw attention, but enough to anchor himself in a moment that was beginning to move beyond his command, and across the room, Naomi Carter remained exactly where she had been, unchanged in posture, unchanged in expression, because for her, this was not disruption, it was completion, the culmination of weeks, months, perhaps even years of quiet observation finally reaching its natural conclusion. She did not watch him with satisfaction. She did not search for a reaction, because this was never about witnessing his response. It was about executing her own, and as the conversations around them resumed, softer now, more measured, carrying an undercurrent of awareness that something significant had just occurred, Naomi took a single step forward, not toward him, but toward the center of the room, where presence carried more weight than proximity, and in that space, recognition settled fully, not as a question, but as a fact. She was no longer someone who had been part of his world, she was now someone who stood independent of it, shaping it in ways that could no longer be ignored. William's gaze found her again, this time without distance to obscure what he was seeing. And for the first time, there was no version of her that fit within his memory, no quiet figure standing beside him, no overlooked presence fading into the background, only this woman, composed, deliberate, holding a position that required no introduction. And in that moment, the realization was complete, not dramatic, not spoken, but absolute. He had not lost her, he had never truly seen her, and that distinction carried more weight than anything the document in his hand could convey. Naomi allowed a brief silence to exist between them. Not as hesitation, but as acknowledgement of a past that no longer defined the present. Then, with the same calm precision that had guided every step of her journey, she spoke, her voice steady, clear, carrying just enough to reach him without needing to rise above the room. "You did not lose me," she said, the words simple, unembellished, yet final in their meaning. "You just never knew where I stood." And there was no accusation in her tone, no bitterness, only truth. The kind that does not demand agreement because it exists independently of it. She did not wait for a response, because this was not a conversation, it was a conclusion. She turned slightly, signaling to Daniel Brooks, who stepped forward with the final set of documents, and within moments, the process that had been set in motion long before this evening moved to its next phase. Signatures would follow, approvals would align, structures would shift, not overnight, not in a way that could be undone with a single decision, but in a progression that had already begun. And as Naomi Carter stepped away from the center of the room, her reflection once again catching in the polished surfaces around her, there was no need to look back, because everything that needed to be seen had already been revealed, not through words, not through confrontation, but through presence, through action, through the quiet certainty of a woman who no longer required acknowledgement to define her worth. And as she walked toward the exit, the city waiting beyond the glass doors, alive with the same movement it had always carried, she did not feel like she was leaving anything behind, because what she had taken was not something that could be held in a room, it was something far more enduring: control, clarity, and the undeniable truth that sometimes, the most powerful transformation is not becoming someone new, but finally allowing the world to see who you have been all along.